Hi everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. I'm Frata Eleftheria, and today I want to ask the question, are we living in the Matrix? True, the Matrix is a fictional film, series of films actually, but is there more to the Matrix than just a fictional story? Is it in fact an allegory for the world in which we live? Is there something false about our reality? Is there some sense in which some part of our reality has been artificially created in order to keep us prisoners? That is what I'm going to explore tonight. If you've been following all of the stuff around Matthew Brown's X post recently, and my involvement in that, which is something I've been covering a lot on this channel recently, then you're probably familiar with Matthew Brown's interview on Weaponized in the weeks or months leading up to that moment. To understand how all of this transpired, Matthew Brown's X posts about UAPs and spirituality, and what might have been informing his thinking in the lead up to that when he blew the whistle on UAP tracking projects within the US government. And so in that Weaponized podcast episode where Matthew Brown makes his disclosure, one curious statement that he makes is that we are in fact living in the Matrix. So I want to explore this idea a bit more in this video. And before I go on, let me just draw attention to this hoodie that I'm wearing. This is my new merch. So I've set up a merch store. I mentioned it in my last video, but I finally got some in to see what it looks like. And yeah, I'm pretty happy with it. So if you want to give me extra support, I'll leave a link in the description of this video for where you can buy some of my merch. But are we living in the Matrix? As I'm sure will come as no surprise to my regular viewers, I do think we're living in the Matrix. I do think that the Matrix is an allegory, that it's more a documentary than a feature film, and that there is a system of control that we live under that is ruled over by invisible forces. But what's even more remarkable is that the Matrix films have as their basis, as their inspiration, a very real set of spiritual teachings which come from the ancient mysteries, but also which are directly inspired by a series of modern occultists who claim to have received their knowledge from a higher power, telepathically communicating with extra-dimensional beings, the very beings which purportedly are behind many of the UAP phenomena today, according to some of these UAP whistleblowers. So in his Weaponized interview, Matthew Brown makes a couple of statements which are very similar to one another. One is that we're living in the Matrix, and another is that there is an invisible prison being built up around us, and it's not finished, and we have a chance to make a different future, but it is being built, and it's this kind of unseen prison. Very similar idea to what is presented in the Matrix films. And it relates to another concept as well, which is very similar to that of a Matrix, which I'd like to introduce you to, and that is the concept of the black iron prison. I spoke about the black iron prison in my previous video talking about Matt Brown's X post, and some of you asked what the black iron prison is. Can I explain what that term means? And so tonight I am going to do that, because it is an idea which I think is reflected in a lot of what Matt Brown said recently, and it's something that I do want to go into more detail about because it's very important. And really the black iron prison is just another word, another name for the real Matrix that we find ourselves living within. And believe it or not, the process of us becoming aware that we are trapped in the black iron prison as a humanity can be linked to the intervention of the light beings, the supposed interdimensional beings behind the UAP phenomenon, or much of it, and the messages that they have given to humanity. So, to break that down a bit more, the Black Iron Prison is a concept which appears in the writings of the sci-fi author Philip K. Dick in his book titled VALIS, VALIS. And I'll refer to Philip K. Dick as PKD from now on. But what VALIS is all about is PKD had an experience where he telepathically communicated with an alien satellite, some kind of extraterrestrial, extra-dimensional being linked to the star Sirius. And these communications form the basis of his book VALIS. PKD didn't want to be labelled as insane, so he passed his very real communication experiences off as just a fictional account. Kind of like, my friend is asking this or that. And one of the messages that this extra-dimensional intelligence gave to PKD about the state of the human race is that we live in this black iron prison. And what the black iron prison can be thought of as like a system of social control, like a control system that we all live in, but it's extra-temporal. So it has existed across time in various different forms, but always more or less the same template. So it existed in Rome as the Roman Empire, and it exists today as our current society, and maybe will exist in another form in the future, depending on how rapidly we can shake off our chains as a species. But it's kind of like this archetype of the empire with total control over our lives. And we see this in sci-fi and fantasy today. Think of the Empire in Star Wars, or other kind of evil empires in different franchises. It's an idea that is deeply rooted in our unconscious as an archetype, as something we fear instinctively, and we may be in denial of it, but something which we are already living in. So the idea of the Black Iron Prison, as it's presented in VALIS, is also associated with a phrase, and that phrase is, "The empire never ended." And the empire, of course, is the Roman Empire. So it's this idea that the Roman Empire, it represented a system of total control. And indeed, this is the way that the early Christians viewed the Roman Empire. And the symbol of the beast in the book of Revelation, which forces everybody to take its mark in order to buy or sell, is a direct commentary on the totalizing authoritarian force that was the Roman Empire. And so it reduces people into digits, it reduces people to cogs in a machine, and denies them their humanity, and really deprives them of their freedom and autonomy. And that is the Black Iron Prison. That is what it means to be imprisoned, to be stuck in a form of society that relegates the human to that tiny bandwidth of experience. Really, it describes the state of oppression. And the phrase, "the empire never ended," simply means that the Roman Empire continues. We think of the fall of the Roman Empire in the 400s AD, or perhaps the fall of Constantinople, if you consider the fall of the Eastern Empire to be the true date of the fall of Rome. But really, the Roman Empire continued on in a different form beyond both of those dates. You had other empires that went after it, which replicated the same template for empire and domination of others long after Rome was gone, and actually inspired by Rome. So the Holy Roman Empire, founded by Charlemagne, well, it was the Frankish Empire back then, but it became the Holy Roman Empire. And then the British Empire, to some extent, the American Empire as well. The Russian Empire, Russia thought of itself as a third Rome, still very much does. The German Empire, in its various forms, very kind of well-known example of an evil empire trying to dominate others. So we see what would be described today as a meme continuing on. Although the political entity of the Roman Empire no longer exists, the mindset or the mentality, that the collective consciousness of Rome never went away and continues to this day and continues to be duplicated throughout history. So we're stuck in this extra-temporal reality of the Black Iron Prison. And PKD was inspired by the ancient Gnostics, like the Valentinians, when he was kind of formulating his worldview, and he got his VALIS communications kind of in that context. But what we have here, it's not reality per se that is the Black Iron Prison. It's much more of a social commentary on the fact that however things may appear to be, whatever illusion of freedom we think we have, we are very much under control. The systems in our lives are very much there to keep us under control. And if you work a 9-to-5 job, you're already innately aware of this. If you've gone through the education system and tried to think independently, you're already innately aware of this. We think we have freedom, but actually when we look at much of our lives, it's very tightly controlled. We're told what to think throughout our lives. We think we're making a choice, but we're just choosing the thing we were told we should want from the very beginning. So we're stuck in this bad trip of the Black Iron Prison. And the VALIS communications tell PKD how we can escape from that, how we can escape from the Black Iron Prison. And I'll go into that later. But first, I want to explain how this idea of the Black Iron Prison, in a very real, literal sense, could have been the inspiration behind the idea of the Matrix brought to us by the Matrix films. So I've done videos on this channel before, some of my very first videos in fact, talking about the spiritual philosophies that underpin many of the themes in the Matrix trilogy and why they're more than just feature films. They're actually important philosophical media in their own right. But there is a more immediate influence on the Matrix films, which is such a strong influence that, in a sense, the Matrix films can be seen as just a rehashing of some earlier stories with changing some of the kind of themes from more spiritual themes to artificial intelligence and machine overlords and things like that. So the story that The Matrix was originally based off of is a graphic novel series by an individual known as Grant Morrison, known as The Invisibles. And it's basically a story of, a ragtag band of rebels and revolutionaries who have become aware that what they think is their normal reality is actually a kind of prison reality that's been set up by these extra-dimensional intelligences that are trying to keep them down, playing the same role that the machines play in the Matrix. And in addition, there's also another faction of extra-dimensional entities who are trying to free the humans. So that's something that doesn't appear so much in the Matrix, but is a feature in the Invisibles. And and that's where the light beings come in. And so that's the narrative that's set up by the Invisibles. You've got a character who's like Morpheus, except he's called the Mob King, and he's white. Was actually Grant Morrison writing himself into his own comic book. But this is the kind of Morpheus character who finds the savior character, who Neo was based off in this particular graphic novel series. And so The Invisibles is the origin of the Matrix, which became a true cultural phenomenon. The Invisibles sort of remained a niche, countercultural kind of thing and wasn't widely known. But the story of how the Invisibles came into being as a graphic novel is very interesting, because Grant Morrison is actually an occultist. He's a massive occultist and mystic and chaos magician. And he's also a UAP contactee. So Grant Morrison tells the story of wanting to make contact with the UAP entities, these extra-dimensional entities. He'd read Robert Anton Wilson and wanted to see if it was true, that what we thought of as aliens were these extra-dimensional entities that you could contact telepathically. So he went to Kathmandu in 1994 and he attempted to make contact, and he did make contact. And he recounts basically an abduction experience from these kind of non-human chrome blobs that abducted him. That's the way that these beings appeared to him. And they gave him a series of messages, which he then carried through into his Invisibles comics. And that was the way that he presented that message to the world. And part of the message was that we live in this control system, this invisible prison. And throughout the Invisible comics, there are references to PKD's Black Iron Prison concept, such as the Empire never ended being graffitied on the wall, and references to the Empire ending and things like that. So there's a direct parallel between the universe of the Invisibles and PKD's Black Iron Prison, and of course the Matrix. And there's a fantastic video out there where Grant Morrison talks about his abduction experience, talks about the origin of the Invisibles and some other really cool stuff to do with magic and mysticism. So I'll link that video in the description below. It wouldn't surprise me if it gets taken down one day. So go check it out while you can. I think it's just a fantastic video, which drops a lot of truth bombs in its own right. And it'd be especially interesting to anybody who is interested in the UAP phenomenon and the spiritual or esoteric dimensions to that phenomenon. So basically, what this Black Iron Prison is it is the idea of empire. It is a certain culture, a certain mindset, which tries to take over everything and make everything like it, make everything the same. It is like a metastasizing mimetic culture that spreads everywhere and tries to get everything and everybody under its thumb. And it won't stop until it's swallowed everything. And because it's an archetype, you can recognize this in various different places. Any kind of large institution where there's a lot of people and it's all very alienated and everyone's treated like a number rather than a person, and it's very hierarchical, and there's a very strict set of rules that everybody has to follow, and it's very important to follow the rules even if they don't make sense. And anything like that, anything that feels like a confined, restricted reality where you have all your creativity and autonomy sucked out of you, is a manifestation of the Black Iron Prison. And really you could say that it predates Rome. You could say that since agriculture came about, it's existed in some form or another. Because of course, if you look at the Bible, which is one area where this control system repeatedly comes up, together with warnings against such a control system, it didn't begin with Rome. If you look at the book of Daniel, and the vision of Daniel and the succession of 4 beasts, before Rome there was the Greek Empire of Alexander. Before that there was the Persians, who were then conquered by the Greeks, who in turn were conquered by the Romans. And before the Persians there were the Babylonians, before they too were conquered. And that is why Babylon is used as a kind of pseudonym for the Roman Empire in the book of Revelation, because it's seen as a continuation of the very same idea of empire that tries to subjugate the free people, the people that want to follow God, not some human tyrant or human system that wants to make everybody else submit to their will. And that is why the beast of Revelation is a composite of the four beasts in Daniel, because it's this idea of eternal empire. And indeed, the book of Revelation and the book of Daniel were some of the influences on PKD and his spiritual outlook. And the thing to understand about the Black Iron Prison is it is all about control. It's about the control of information. It's about the control of human beings. Above all, it is about the control of our mind, what we think, how we think, what we're allowed to think about, what opinions we're allowed to have, which we're subtly told and not really given a free choice. And, it can be applied to the system of interests that is keeping the UAP phenomenon a secret as well, and trying to gatekeep that and stop that from coming to light. It's part of the very same system, which I suppose is why Matthew Brown would be invested in challenging it. But more sinister than just some social or political form of control, what the Black Iron Prison is really about is keeping us alienated from our true nature, our divine nature, and also keeping us stuck in materialism so that we don't realize our full spiritual potential. There's a whole lot of things that we can do, whether it's to manifest things, whether it's, what would be classed as psychic phenomena and ways that we can look more deeply into reality that way. All these things about us, our potential, that makes us so much greater than we think we are. And that knowledge has been suppressed because it doesn't suit the powerful. That's why the witches were burned back in the day. It's not because witchcraft comes from the devil. That's something that you've been taught to believe, because that's what the Black Iron Prison wants you to believe. But really, if we can communicate directly with God and with Spirit, and we can manifest anything we desire through the power of that Spirit, we have no need for religious authorities anymore. And it's much harder for temporal authorities to keep us under control and keep us in a state of imposed scarcity where we rely entirely on them in order to survive. So it's actually a lot more sinister, and it's a reality that obscures our most free, most spiritual nature. And the way that we can escape the Black Iron Prison, the way that we escape the Matrix, is by becoming aware of our true nature once more. At least that's how we can escape from its influence on an individual level. But the extra-dimensional intelligence that communicated the plot of VALIS to PKD describes the way that the Black Iron Prison will finally be defeated in this external, phenomenal reality. But what VALIS does first is describes what not to do. So the Black Iron Prison, the empire, if you will, it's this oppressive force, and so the temptation is to try and fight against it and destroy it in the conventional way. But what VALIS tells us is that the empire reproduces itself by spreading its own derangement to others. And so when people fight the empire, they in turn become the empire. Kind of like what Nietzsche says about if you're fighting monsters, take care that you don't become one. Because in order to be able to overcome the empire, on its own terms, you have to resonate with it, you have to become like it. And so you end up becoming it. So even if the empire is overcome by another political force, that political force just becomes the new empire, just like the beasts of Daniel. So the derangement of the empire is like a contagion for all who stand against it. And you see this in all the great revolutions of history as well. I mean, look at Russia, for example. The Tsar was overthrown, and the Soviet system that was put in its place was just as imperialistic, just as totalitarian. So that is a good illustration of how the empire reproduces itself by spreading its derangement to others, who start off as the resistance, but very quickly morph into the very thing they're trying to destroy. So what is the solution then? VALIS describes another force that has come into the world in order to defeat the empire, and that is the Christ principle. And the way that the Christ principle defeats the empire is very unique. It doesn't confront the empire in that conventional sense of like confrontation and defeat, but rather the Christ defeats the empire through a process which VALIS describes as phagocytosis. So this is actually a term from biology, and it describes the way that a T cell, a white blood cell, is able to intercept disease, viruses and bacteria and things, and then actually devour them and remove the threat. And what phagocytosis involves is surrounding the foreign kind of body, which is trying to invade and take over. And then once it has been surrounded and enclosed, dissolving that invading cell and then absorbing it into the T cell and incorporating it into the T cell. So we have this process of expansion, of the T cell doing its own thing, the cell walls spreading in their own formation until they've surrounded and encompassed the smaller cell. And then that allows the cell to absorb the material and incorporate it into itself. But it's kind of comparatively non-violent to the combative way that we might think of, fighting off, other people in an army or something like that. And I think what it points to is this idea of people creating an alternative culture, an alternative state of mind to that of the Black Iron Prison, and that's spreading for a time. And when it reaches a critical mass, it will become so big that it will simply overwhelm the machinery of the empire and the Black Iron Prison. And the empire will have no choice but to adapt itself to become something which follows the new norms that are set by that culture. And so rather than taking an oppositional perspective of us versus them, which replicates the thinking of the empire, instead it's a way of seeing in a non-dual way, seeing the totality of life and having compassion, recognizing that perhaps the empire was created for a reason, perhaps because it gave people security, because it provided order in a very chaotic and disordered world, and then trying to find a place for the empire where it's not a distortion of true order and true civilization. And so it's about the mixing together to produce something new, and a cooperation between parts to peaceably negotiate a new form of reality, and one which takes the good out of the empire as well, and considers a way of incorporating that into a new form of society. And that's really kind of what happened with the spread of Christianity through the Roman Empire. Pagan Rome was a very brutal place. The second and third books of the Book of the Law would, no one would bat an eyelid if they read that in ancient Rome, because that was the mentality that people already had. Crush the weak, victory to the strong. The majority of people are just objects to be used by the elite. And that was the Roman mindset. That was the imperial mindset. And when Christian morality came along and Christianity spread through the empire, it transformed the empire. And then that changed the course of history. And it gave rise to, we wouldn't have our modern system of international human rights, flawed though it is, if it wasn't for that phagocytosis by the Christ spirit of the empire. We wouldn't have democracy as we know it. We wouldn't have the concept of liberty as we know it. And to some extent, you could say that what John Dee was trying to do with the British Empire was a kind of transformation from within of this idea of the empire into something that could become an instrument for creating the kingdom of God on earth. And apparently that's what the Enochian angels were trying to help him to do. So that process has happened before in history, albeit imperfectly, because there are still very many manifestations of the black iron prison in our world, obviously. But just as the empire repeats itself, the process of the Christ principle spreading and absorbing the empire and changing it into something for good can also repeat itself. And I think that is the way that the change is going to have to happen in our world. And it all comes back to that spiritual awakening. That's where the process really begins. Because then we create a new mindset in ourselves that is free of the influence of the black iron prison. And then we can acculturate that in others and build a community around that instead. And that's really where it begins. So that's it. That is the real Matrix. That is the inspiration for the Matrix in the films. And that is how we can escape it and how we can ultimately overcome it. And how our awareness of this idea came about because of the intervention of the extra-dimensional beings behind the UAP phenomenon, allegedly. So I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, please leave a like so the algorithm sees it. Another big machine that nobody asked for that controls aspects of our lives. Subscribe to this channel to support my work. And if you want to support me further, hit join or thanks down below. And remember that I will also be presenting at EnochiaCon in July. So go to that conference if you're interested in all things Enochian magic. I will leave a link to that in the description below. But thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.